Hi, good afternoon. This is being live streamed on Channel 14 Norwich. I'm Sheila Horvitz. This is Talkback. I've been doing shows during this coronavirus crisis for the last several weeks and will continue on talking to everyone who has been impacted by what's happening. And that's almost everyone. So I'm talking to our political leaders. I'm talking to some of our teachers, our medical people, our entertainment people. And now I have the great pleasure to talk to someone who's been a dear friend, who's an expert on someone that we all should be paying more attention to in our lives. I'm going to give you a hint. We talked about him in high school, maybe in college. We went to hear some of his words, some of the best words in the English language ever created, and someone who we have lots of lessons to learn from today if we pay attention. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Kate Powers. Hi, Kate. It's good to see you. Hi. And Kate is a teacher of over 40 years of English, and her specialty was, can you guess who we were talking about? William Shakespeare. Kate, why is William Shakespeare such a mystique in so many ways to so many people?
Well, Shakespeare spoke to the whole world. Education level didn't matter. Century didn't matter. He took the past and showed how much it had in common with the present in his time. And when we see it, it still somehow resonates. He had the ability to inhabit the characters he created. I mean, it's astounding that a man in his mid-30s could create a character like Juliet, who lives and breathes and is really 13 years old. And she acts like a 13-year-old. And yet he shows us how she's growing up in the space of a matter of hours, right, which happens in our lives when we face crises.
And so he wrote about kings. He wrote about every aspect of human existence. And so what was it about you and your studies growing up and then going to college and becoming a teacher that gave you the great interest in Shakespeare? Because I know you did your doctoral thesis on Shakespeare. Tell us about that.
Well, I had a great high school English teacher when I was a senior, Miss Caswell. She taught Hamlet, and I thought that Hamlet was just the greatest human being in the world. Of course, I was very young and, was quite willing to just accept him whole. I didn't see flaws in the character that Shakespeare was working out as the play went on, although I certainly was aware of the growth. I found it very exciting, very immediate. I found his characters to feel like people that I knew and I could learn a lot of lessons from. Then as the 70s rolled around and I was looking for a topic for a master's thesis, the women's movement was really big. And I started examining women characters in Shakespeare and looking at how they often enough burst out of really confined roles. Women's sphere was in the home, and she had her big adventures before she got married, and that was a very brief time. She didn't have many social freedoms, and Shakespeare creates some characters that he puts in positions where they are separated from their whole social structure. One of them is Rosalind in As You Like It, who's cast out into the wilderness. And in order to ensure survival, she decides dressing like a boy would be a good idea. She has her cousin with her, who retains her girl clothes. But Rosalind, once she gets into the forest of Arden, finds out that the man she loves has also come to the forest. And her first thought is, oh no, what will I do with my doublet and hose? He knows me as a beautiful woman, and now I look like a boy. And she's very resourceful. She always just goes with what's there, and she decides that she's going to have some fun. So she pretends to be a stranger and question him about his Rosalind and get him to express what his love is actually like, which is following all the conventions of someone who doesn't even know the person they love. And she teaches him a lot of lessons pretending to be a boy.
That's interesting. So it's interesting that you were able to capture the spirit of the times that you were living in and use Shakespeare as a resource for examples, for the way men and women relate to one another and so on. I mean, it shows how timely he is, even though he started out in the 1500s, right?
Yes. It was a time when we were looking at women's roles, and we were looking at, how much we hadn't been allowed to do. And Shakespeare creates several characters who don't look at who's going to allow them to do anything. They define themselves. And I saw that as a good life lesson. I think that's the job that each of us has in life. Life is such a huge gift. And then we get several gifts that go along with it, several different abilities. And we have to pick and choose because there's not enough time in life to do everything that you possibly could.
Right. So Shakespeare has been a big part of your life. And I know we can talk about life's coincidences. You and I go back to 1966, one classroom in a junior high school in Brockton, Massachusetts. You were teaching English, and right next door in the other classroom, I was teaching history. We started up a friendship that we thought would not be able to follow through when we both went off with different things. The Vietnam War was raging then. We went off to different states for a while. And then we both wound up in Connecticut and have been together ever since. So that's been interesting. And you've taught both in the Massachusetts and the Connecticut schools, isn't that right?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And then while you were teaching in high school in Connecticut, you took a sabbatical and went to Brown University, where you got your PhD in Shakespeare. And I was very honored to be invited to listen to your dissertation defense. Explain what that is.
The defense was fun. When you have the defense, you've written the whole work. So you're the one who knows that work better than anyone else. And you have 3 professors who have read your work, who question you on it. And it was a delight. It was like the beginning of a party. Well, actually, I guess it was the beginning of a party.
Okay. So let's try to demystify Shakespeare, because I think a lot of people said, well, that's high school stuff. It's college stuff. The writing is too stilted for me. I can't understand it. We got to demystify him. And lots of historians are questioning exactly what he looked like. Because is it true that there weren't a lot of any renderings of him, because they didn't have photography then? But it doesn't seem to be a lot of portraits of him. Isn't that so?
Very few. There are 2 portraits, a Droeshout portrait and a Chandros portrait. The Chandros is more informal, and we know that there was a picture of him with the first release of his collected works. So that's what we base everything on.
Okay. So let's go back. Give us a little thumbnail history of his life. He was born in the early, I believe, the 1500s, and he lived for 52 years. And according to what I've read, they list his date of birth as the same day as his date of death. Tell us about his life.
Okay. His date of birth wasn't actually recorded, but the date of his christening was. And since it was a custom to christen a baby when they were 3 days old, we assumed that his birthday was April 23rd, 1564. Interesting family. His parents came from quite different backgrounds. His father had grown up on lands that were leased from a large landowner, um, and had been farmed by his father. The large landowner was the father of Shakespeare's mother. So the tenant farmer's son and the daughter of the man who owned the manor house married. She was the youngest daughter of Richard Arden, and in his will he left her 50 acres. And shortly after that, she married Shakespeare's father.
Wasn't she older than Shakespeare? Wasn't Shakespeare younger? Wasn't he like 18 and she was older?
Oh, that's Shakespeare himself. I'm talking about the parents right
Right,
now.
right.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
No, Shakespeare himself, yes, he married a much older woman. Shakespeare had to be a very unconventional young man. He was very hungry for life. He was very well educated, they tell you a grammar school education. What they usually don't tell you is that the tutors or teachers were graduates of Oxford, and they were well paid. So my Shakespeare advisor had told me he thought it was the equivalent of about 2 years at a good college. But anyway, Shakespeare, yes, at the age of 18, was giving his parents a difficult time. He was seeing a 26-year-old, Anne Hathaway. Even today, that would be a big age gap. But then when people aged more quickly, it was more marked. Anne Hathaway was pregnant when Shakespeare married her, when he was 18 and she was 26. They had a daughter, and less than 2 years later, they had twins. So before Shakespeare turned 21, he had 3 children.
Wow. And was that his child? Are we certain that the child that Anne Hathaway was pregnant with was Shakespeare's?
I've never seen that questioned. And Shakespeare, people often think that Shakespeare broke ties with Stratford, but actually he traveled back and forth probably quite a bit. He, like people today, he was in a position where he needed to move to get a good job, and the place to get the job was London. So he was away from home, but could travel back and forth by horseback.
Okay. Let's go back to his parents that you started, told us about his mother and his father, and I jumped in and got to Anne Hathaway, his wife. So
okay.
He grew up in relative comfort. Was it modest because his mother was the daughter of a fairly wealthy landowner, right? Did he grow up in modest comfort?
Well, that's kind of interesting because their fortunes were somewhat mixed. The father was very ambitious, and he had some setbacks financially. Possibly invested his wife's money too quickly. He bought 3 residences, 2 of them adjoined. One of them is one half is the Shakespeare birthplace. And he had political ambitions. He was part of the town council and eventually the equivalent of mayor. And his children were allowed to go to school for free. And then at a given point, he had a reversal in fortunes. He had a good business. He was a gloveman. And gloves were very ornate. They were embroidered in gold and silks and sometimes had precious stones. So this was a luxury product. And he had done a 7-year apprenticeship to be able to do the work that he did. So no doubt he was quite good. But he did, financially, he seemed to go up and down. And so Shakespeare, when he was married and had these 3 little children, would have been very much on his own.
So when did he go to London, and what interest did he have in writing at the beginning? And then, of course, also acting. Sometimes that went hand in hand, didn't it?
Yes. In fact, it's assumed that he probably acted and did odd jobs around the theater before he actually got into the writing. We don't know an exact date when he went. It would be a reasonable conjecture that he would have been probably about 23. That summer, there was a group called the Queen's Players who came to entertain in Stratford. And the records show that they were missing one actor. It's been conjectured that maybe Shakespeare filled in and then maybe went back to London with them. But he would have gone to London around that time. And within 3 years, he had his first play on stage.
What was his first play?
His first play was Henry VI. So he began writing history plays, which I thought was an interesting choice because England was under Queen Elizabeth now, but they were still trying to create a sort of glorious history for themselves. And when you go into history plays, of course, you've got to use a lot of fiction because you don't know who said what or who was there. You just have some basic facts. So you might think of something like today, Fiddler on the Roof, where you create actually a myth of origin for the Russian Jewish immigrants that end up in New York. Shakespeare is creating a myth of origin for the English people. He writes several history plays. And so he's showing them this is who we are. And while he's doing it, he's also doing some creating of who we are and what's important to us, what are our values.
So this first play that he created, did he also act in it?
We don't have any record of that. We don't have any real records of his acting. There is a long tradition that said that he played the ghost in Hamlet, and that he played a minor role in As You Like It, an old man. To choose men of a lot of experience, whether they're old or ghosts, would have been suitable because he, had such a far-ranging mind, and he was interested in. He found people more interesting as they got older.
Do we know what there was in his life and background that led him to theater, to writing, and impelled him to write these historical plays initially?
Well, that's an interesting thing because theater, before Shakespeare began writing, was really very limited. When Shakespeare was a child, the plays that would have been available were, you might have seen a morality play in which each of the characters would be an abstract virtue. So, the play Everyman is going to die, and he wants to know what friend will go with him on this journey. And of course, riches won't go with him, and several of the other things that he valued in life won't go with him. And finally, he can only bring his soul, his own character, what he's achieved. So theater was used to teach people morality. They also had mystery plays, which were religious plays. So people sitting in church for a long time might get bored, and at some point, they started doing dramatizations. One of the popular ones was a Christmas one, a nativity play. And eventually, someone introduced one of the shepherds as a thief and a swindler. And so now you start getting some characters that, so you have a little bit of interplay. But characters of depth and ideas, that's not something he grew up with. He did grow up a background in Greek and Roman history and writing.
So did he introduce those concepts into the theater then? Was that his role?
That's an interesting question because a lot of people think that he's the one who did it. He actually had some competitors who were very good. He just carried the concepts further and faster and wider than anyone else did. He wrote
What was theater? You mentioned some of the plays that existed before the Shakespeare's plays came along, and some of his other contemporaries doing similar things. What was theater like? I mean, you hear the expression of the Globe Theater. Was that a theater that he helped establish? And what was it like going to the theater in London? Were there theaters in Stratford on Avon where he resided, or would people go to London for their theater experience? And what were the actors like?
Well, the theaters, originally they were not, they didn't have buildings that were dedicated as theaters. The ones when Shakespeare was a child would have been portable theaters. It would be like a very large table used for a stage with a box-like structure at the back that would be used for costuming, where you would change your costumes or go off stage. The table and box structure would be set up in a public place, or preferably in the courtyard of an inn. The courtyard of an inn was very good because if you did it there, this would be the open courtyard near the stables. You would have a driveway to get in, and you'd be able to make sure that everyone who came in paid. Also, the people who were staying at the inn would be able to view it from their rooms or from balconies. And this was, this was prime seating, because if the weather changed, you still could, you'd have a little more leeway if you were at the inn. The actors would just go on with the show. The early theaters in London that were being formed right about that time were in large halls. They took the same idea of, let's have a flat stage, table-like, raised, and let's have the box at the back. The other type of structure that was very interesting to theater people was originally not actually a theater. It was the bear pit or the bull pit. If you think of, like the Spanish bull ring, you get the idea. A bear or a bull would be chained to a stake on the floor of the pit. You had raked seating going all the way up the sides of the circle. And dogs would be set on the animal, and people would take bets on how many dogs it would take to kill the animal, how long the animal would last, which dog might succeed in finishing the animal off. They had all sorts of different ways of betting. But when you hear about bulldogs and the way that the jaws grip, the dogs were actually bred to hang on when they bit. So the theater people looked at this one and figured they could seat the people all the way around. Everyone would have a pretty good view because of the way that that it's raked up to the sides. And then the place in the middle where the dogs would have been running could be used for what they called groundlings. And you could charge a really cheap admission for people who wanted to stand up through the play. They would charge a penny admission, and it was usually crowded. Of course, what that meant is that the theater going audience was all kinds of people. You didn't have to have money. You weren't necessarily educated. You didn't have any particular social status. You had a mix. It was very, very democratic theater.
What about the Globe Theater? Tell us about that.
Globe Theater is based on, it was not the first circular theater, but it was based on that idea of the bear pit. The circular theater with the thrust stage and the room for the groundlings and box seats going up the sides. The picture that's usually shown in books for what the Globe looked like is actually the Swan Theater, which was quite similar. So there were other round theaters. Shakespeare's choice of name for the Globe, wasn't just accidental or fanciful. Shakespeare created a world. In fact, one of his lines is, "All the world's a stage." And he saw us as actors on that stage. He saw every one of us having a part to play. And he delved further to look at the fact that every one of us has a history we bring with us too.
Now, when he first started writing his plays and then they were performed in London and at the Globe, was it a money-making proposition? Was he able to make a living doing that and to go back to Stratford where his family was and support them? What was that like?
He was able to make a living. Things were going well. He was popular right away. Within a couple of years of the time his first play was produced, he was being attacked by another playwright in writing as thinking he was the only Shakespeare in the country. Well, Shakespeare actually wasn't, from anything we know, a conceited person, but there was a lot of jealousy, and so that tells us that people must have thought he was pretty good. Okay. Problem: he was only doing his plays for 3 years when he ran into a situation like COVID-19. The plague struck London. And of course, as we found with our own plague, the theaters get closed. And then Shakespeare was left without employment. He had been doing very well, and suddenly everything stopped. So he had to reinvent himself for a while. And he took the time to write poetry. That's where the poems come from. Now, people didn't publish plays. He never assumed that anyone would want to read his plays. He assumed that they would want to see his plays. But the poems were something people would buy and read. In writing the poems, when you wrote poems in those days, you didn't market them. You got a sponsor or a patron who gave you a certain amount of money, so you could, you'd have your money to live on while you did your artistic work. And that's what Shakespeare did. He also evidently was writing plays because the theaters were closed again the next summer, and he came back strong. He had material ready.
Okay, so other interesting question that I asked was about the actors. We know that many men were actors. Were there women actors during this Elizabethan time, during Shakespeare's time?
Simple answer, no. There were young boys who played the parts of women. They had to, of course, continually be replaced because they would age out, their voices would change. You also had to get extremely talented young boys because some of the women's roles are quite complex. But no women, none. That probably was a point of interest for Shakespeare when he began examining roles and how much of the way that we see people has to do with the way that they dress, including how we see men and how we see women, which then allowed him to look at women's narrow role and work a lot on broadening it by just changing costume.
Okay, so let's take a look now. I want you to tell us about the breadth of his work, about how many, I think he wrote about 30, 40 plays, and then you talked about the poetry, the sonnets. Just give us kind of an overview, and then we'll go into a couple of your favorites and something about them. Give us an overview of the works that he produced.
Well, he wrote 37 plays. He probably collaborated on others. He did this very, very fast, and he was very, very successful with it. Within 10 years of the time he started writing his plays, he was back in Stratford buying the house that we know as New Place. New Place was a really a big step up. It was 60 feet across the front and 80 feet back, and there was a lot of land with it. So, he was very successful in writing his plays. He also bought more than 100 acres a few years later. But what did he write? He wrote histories, which helped create a national identity for England. He wrote comedies. Many of them have those, the comedies all have heroines. The woman is the main character, really. You have balancing roles, of course, from the men, but the comedies all celebrate feminine virtues. They celebrate flexibility, they celebrate community, they celebrate life. And the tragedies, on the other hand, concern themselves with what would have been considered the stereotypically masculine values, particularly power. But the reason that they are tragic is that they separate people from each other. There's the absence of community, the death of lovers, that sort of thing. Toward the end, he wrote something that we call romances, and the romances were ones that basically reached into a supernatural world. Things happened, when on Prospero's island. Prospero knew magic. And Prospero in The Tempest was attended by Ariel, who is a sprite. Ariel is a little bit like a fairy, but more spirited and very intelligent and lively. In another one, The Winter's Tale, he has a statue that supposedly a statue that comes to life. It's he was very jealous of it's about a king who, in The Winter's Tale, very jealous of his wife, thinks she's cheated on him and she's pregnant. And he arranges to have her brought to another land and abandoned, where bears and tigers can get her. She's going to die. She's just going to be abandoned somewhere in the wilderness. Well, of course, it's a romance, so she survives. And 20 years later, he sees a statue that is, totally marvelous, that, of course, comes to life, and it's really his wife. It's there that has been standing as the statue. But a lot of very imaginative things, but everything moves toward community and unity and love in the romances.
So so did he write was there certain periods of his life where he wrote the histories, other periods, as you say, the more romance toward the end, in the beginning, more histories, then the comedies? Can you give us just give us a thumbnail? We don't have, we wish we had the time to go through each play, but give us an example of some of the histories, the names of them, and one or two that are your favorites, and then we'll go on to the comedies and then to some of the poetry, especially the sonnets which he wrote.
Okay, the histories, the early ones, he was dealing with England when it was in a period of breakdown. He wrote 3 Henry VI plays, which show England in chaos because they don't have a strong leader. He wrote the Henry IV plays about showing what happens when you do have a strong leader who usurps the throne. Henry IV was the cousin of the king, so he would have been they would have both had a grandfather that was a king. The people were on the side of Henry IV by and large because he was quite competent, but he dethroned the present king in order to take over England. And of course, the usurper is never going to be the rightful king, no matter how good he is. So he has to wait for his son, Henry V, which, now will be born to the throne. And of course, that's a wonderfully heroic play about the king who goes over to France and fights for territory there and defeats the French with a very small army, very small, very brave.
Is that your favorite? Is Henry V your favorite of the
history?
of the history plays?
Of the histories, yes. Kenneth Branagh did an absolutely brilliant film of Henry V. I think that's the best one I've ever seen. That's
Okay.
shows the wonderful heroism, and that shows England. That shows like what England has become, the myth of the greatness that they were aiming toward, that he was aiming toward in the stories.
And now, how about give us the example of some of the comedies?
Comedies, yeah. As You Like It, the one that I mentioned earlier about the girl who changes into the boy's outfit and ends up basically teaching him how he should behave if he's really in love with her, that you don't just follow what people say you do when you're in love, that you have to really reinvent love, that every couple has to reinvent love for themselves. So it's wonderfully done. Much Ado About Nothing, Beatrice and Benedict, probably the wittiest of Shakespeare's characters, of his lovers. Each of them dead set against marriage. Benedict doesn't want to be entrapped by a woman who will then will tame him. And Beatrice does not want to be trapped by a man who will think he owns her. A wonderful battling of wits. And of course, they end up finding that they're really very suited for each other and that neither of them is going to dominate. Once again, they're reinventing love according to who they are.
And how about talking about the plays that seem to be in the consciousness of most of the general public? I mean, when we think of it, we think of Hamlet, we think of Romeo and Juliet. I do think of Much Ado About Nothing. Tell us about Hamlet. Why has that risen to the level of the greatness and the probably most produced play of all time? Would you agree with that?
Quite possibly. It's produced all over the world. And it's quite possibly. Hamlet, Shakespeare's ability, once again, to become the character that he's writing about, he explores. He doesn't just, fashion characters. He explores the character, and the character grows organically. Shakespeare is looking at a young man who can't figure out how to live his life, and he's living in very, very difficult circumstances. He's basically tried to escape from his life by going to college in Germany, and he's been there for a very long time. Although Hamlet acts as if he's perhaps 18 and has a girlfriend who's about 16, we find out late in the play that he's actually 30 years old, and he spent all this time searching for meaning and searching for his life. What he learns, life lesson that any of us have to learn, is that we fit into our own lives, that no matter how difficult they are, we have tasks that we need to do, things that we need to accomplish. He's born to be king, and his uncle has murdered his father and married his mother and become king. And Hamlet is there on the sidelines, very upset. But he's not taking action to become king. He tries so hard to figure out what's the truth. He's been told that his uncle was guilty, but he has to prove it. He has to prove it. He has to prove it. He can't act on faith. And eventually, when he hasn't been acting, his uncle has the upper hand and sends him with his two friends who are going to betray him, sends him to England, supposedly to collect a tribute from the English king. England is supposed to pay tribute to Denmark so they won't have wars. Hamlet discovers the letters while his friends are sleeping, and he tells Horatio afterward, how absolutely amazing it is that there seems to be, providence in the fall of a sparrow, that everything has its reason and that things work out. Because he couldn't sleep, he decided to look at what they were carrying, and he found out that they were sending him to his death. But he's already at sea. He's supposed to be killed as soon as he gets to England. Well, the next morning, a pirate ship attacks the ship he's on. And as soon as the pirate ship grapples onto Hamlet's ship, Hamlet crosses over to the pirates. Okay, you think he's in bad shape? Pirates? Well, he finds out that pirates are people. They listen to him. He does promise them a reward, but they bring him back to Denmark. And what he tells Horatio that he's learned, and finally brings him peace, is that there will be a time to act, and readiness is all. You can't force it. You have to live with life, we don't control it, but we do control ourselves. And then he, of course, is able to, as he's dying, work out his destiny. Kill his uncle, yes.
So that play is very famous, but you hear a lot of people say, I don't want to read a lot of that Shakespeare. I can't make out the text. I can't figure out how the words fit. I can't work that through. And I don't like it that everybody dies at the end. That doesn't happen in all of the plays, right? It happens in some of them, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, a lot of the historical plays. Why is that death such a big part of the conclusions of so many of Shakespeare's plays?
Well, tragedies do end in death. That's just how the genre works. And histories, they're all dead before we read about them. But why is it such a big thing? Well, let's go to Juliet again. Beginning of the play, Juliet's a child. She's 13. There's a young man who, with a title, he's a count. He wants to marry her and has approached her father. And she's told that he'll be at a party that night. The father wants the man to wait a couple of years till she's, more than 2 years. He wants to wait until she's had her 16th birthday. And the mother says, well, he's going to be at the party tonight, and, look at him and see what you think of him, because the parents would like her to have a happy marriage, and they want her to marry someone she likes. And she says, well, I'll look at him and I'll see if I can like him, but I won't go any further than you give me permission to. And she's the very good little girl following all the rules. She meets Romeo, and everything changes. And when she comes out on the balcony and doesn't know he's standing there right underneath, she starts talking about him and how much she loves him. And she's going into a whole rhapsody about, she says that ends with, give me my Romeo, and when he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night. And, it's the child fantasy. It's the death and stars, but nothing real. Well, he's standing right there. He's heard everything. And when he finds out that, when she finds out that he's there, she's very embarrassed. And she responds by saying, well, I would have played the game. I would have acted hard to get, which is what girls were supposed to do. But, you've already heard me. So, if you still want me to, I'll play the game. But otherwise, I wouldn't, not for the whole world. You already know. And she's the one that proposes marriage, and everything moves, of course, very, very fast. But what's happened with Juliet is that she comes to know herself. She grows up very quickly. She comes to know herself. Romeo is suitable. In fact, he's just been talking about her, and before she comes out, and what would happen if some stars in the sky had errands to do, and they came down and sat in Juliet's eyes, and they put Juliet's eyes up in the sky, then everyone would worship the sky. So we see that what Shakespeare's done with language is showing us that these, they're compatible. They're both thinking in the same images. There are a lot of images of light and fire that go through the language of each of them, and not necessarily when they're hearing each other. But Juliet shows us that she accepts herself when she says she doesn't want to play the game. She certainly accepts Romeo. She makes a commitment. And the world they live in is very fragile. And the lesson that Shakespeare has to teach is that hate kills. That hate is always destructive. And hate will destroy what you love the most if you hate. And of course, this is what her parents get at the end. And through their deaths, the families become reconciled. Romeo's father says that when he hears the story, he says he's going to build a monument to Juliet with a gold statue, pure gold. And when Juliet's father hears that, he says, and I'll have a statue of Romeo, so that they'll be side by side, and it will be just as rich as the one that you're building.
All right.
So now the communities come back together,
All right.
which often doesn't happen. Yeah.
So you've given us some information about why hatred, why tragedies happen, and how Shakespeare exemplifies that in so many of his plays and so many of the life lessons. And I guess that's why he's so important, because he's done it in the language that's most beautiful, most expressive, and it can be done on the stage in front of our eyes. We can read it on the page, but we can also see it in the theater, and that kind of makes it special. There's nothing like live theater to express the emotions and all the different temperaments that people have. So we have a little bit of an album that we put together that I want you to share. I'm going to share the screen and talk about some of these photos that show your interest in Shakespeare over the years. Let me do that, and let's see what we can come up with. Shakespeare, allow. Okay, do you see this screen, Kate?
Oh, the sonnet?
Yes, this is the sonnet.
Yes.
And you sent that to me. You said this was your favorite sonnet. And just give us a quick thumbnail about what the sonnets kind of do and what Shakespeare did with them.
Okay. This one is not typical of the sonnets because the sonnets follow conventions in which the man is in love with a beautiful woman and the woman doesn't love him. So she's always cruel and she won't pay attention. And he's always very loving and so there's always this pursuit in them. The reason I included this one is that the structure that he's following is very clear here. And I thought it might be kind of fun to look at in these days of isolation, because it's almost, writing a sonnet can be almost like a game. If you look at the 14 lines, it's divided into 4 parts. There are 4 lines that say basically, you can see that I'm in the autumn of my life. And then there are another 4 lines that say, basically, I'm in the sunset of my life and it's almost dark. And he says, and you can see this, you know that I'm near the end of my life. Then the 3rd set of 4 lines, he says that I'm like the dying fire. I'm like the when just the embers are there, and eventually, the ashes close in and smother out even the remaining embers that have dropped. So basically, he's saying three different times, I'm at the end of my life. And then the couplet at the end gives us a new insight. We assume that it's going to say something like, so I know you're sad because I'm going to have to leave you. But it doesn't. It says, you see this and you love me even more because you know that you are going to have to leave me. And of course, that is what happens when someone dies, isn't it? That they don't leave us as such. We leave because we have to go on with our lives. It's an interesting way to work with an idea, dividing it into 3 parts and then drawing a conclusion. And he has a rhyme pattern too, that if somebody wanted to try that out, it's, it's a fairly simple rhyme pattern. If you look at the first 4 lines and call the word behold, if you labeled that A, because it's your first word, you go down to the 3rd line and you have another A. Old rhymes with behold. So you get, and then the 2nd line, you would label the ending word there B. So basically, when you take the first 4 lines, you've got A, B, A, B for your rhyming pattern. It continues the same with the next one, C, D, C, D, and then E, F, E, F, and then a new rhyme, G, G. But not all sonnets rhyme. A lot of people write sonnets today that don't rhyme, but it's a very disciplined form, and it's a formula. So it's a challenge. It's an interesting task to take on if you have an idea you want to explore.
Okay, let's go. Let's take a look at, is this kind of what we envision Shakespeare to have looked like?
That's a fair approximation. It's a little bit dramatized, of course, with his very pointed mustache, but the pictures that we see of him, the deep eyes and the high cheekbones and the general structure of the face look similar, yes, and the receding hairline. We don't have any depictions of him from when he was young.
Right. Here's a statue of him, I guess.
Yes, that's a bronze from the 1800s. It's about 20 inches tall. And what's good about this one is the detailing. The modeling of the head is well done, but the detailing of the costume is very closely followed right down to the shoes. It's and also it shows the in the Victorian era, Shakespeare was one of the really important people. They could actually sell these bronzes. This wasn't the only one made.
Right. Here's another one. I guess that's another view of it.
I did it. Yes, I did that close up just to show the show details of the costume. Yes, and you can see a little of the molding of the face too.
Yeah. This is just some of the things that you've collected in the world of Shakespeare, right?
Yes, those particular ones were performances right here, relatively recent performances right in the Hartford area. Okay. The playbills.
The Tempest, Henry, Merry Wives of Windsor, Macbeth. One of the comedies, right? Macbeth.
And 12th Night, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's that?
Oh, this is a silk scarf from the New York City Library gift shop. It prints most of the first 30 sonnets of Shakespeare. So it's very carefully done. And it's kind of nice because I can actually wear it and I can read one if I want to. But it's interesting, something like this kind of artifact would be created, wearable art. There's a group called the Unemployed Philosophers Guild that has created several items of Shakespeareana.
Here's one of the sonnets. Yes. Shall I compare the two? Is that probably the most famous sonnet?
It's probably the best known one. Yeah. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Yeah. Yeah. And of course, it deals with if you look at the final couplet, it deals with a theme that Shakespeare used very often in his poetry, that you know, you're beautiful, and many of them will talk about you're beautiful, but your beauty is going to fade. Time is your enemy. In this one, it's you're beautiful, but actually time is never going to be able to conquer you because of what I've written about you. This will live on and people will know how beautiful you were.
So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee.
Yes.
How beautiful is that? Right.
Wonderful. And it's kind of a nice way of complimenting his own poem, too.
Right, right. Right. This is a poster for Pleasure for Pleasure.
That's what it looks like. It's actually the play is Measure for Measure.
Oh, Measure for Measure. It looks like, isn't that funny? It's Measure for Measure.
Well, this was done at Westland. The director actually come over from Oxford in England. And she was horrified when she saw the poster because she said it looks like Pleasure for Pleasure. I think that the
Oh, that's so funny, and that's what grabbed me. I know it's not
yes,
the right play. That's funny. Yeah.
yes, and I think that the person who designed the poster probably did that on purpose if they knew the play, because the play has a lot to do with with a dukedom that is in complete disarray. People are running wild. There's a lot of prostitution and drinking and
Well,
generally.
it could have been a spoof
Yes,
on Measure for Measure, calling it Pleasure for Pleasure, right? It could be. Yeah.
yes.
All right.
One of the bit players. When I was there, I didn't do any speaking parts. I just did bit parts myself because my voice. I can read Shakespeare poetry, but it always sounds like poetry. And people who act in Shakespeare plays have to make it sound like regular conversation, which is an ability I don't have. But one of the other bit players did that caricature of me on the poster, so that was his.
Now, I have to tell everybody that I keep trying to find gifts for you that have Shakespeare relationship. Did I give you those socks? I probably
You certainly did. You did.
So you got Shakespeare socks.
And they're by the Unemployed Philosophers Guild.
Okay, great. That's terrific. That's terrific.
Hmm.
And then finally, this is a lovely poster of Much Ado About Nothing at the Hartford stage, right?
Yes. Yes. Okay. That's been a popular way of presenting Much Ado About Nothing, to do it in a 1920s style. I saw one in London that also set it in the 1920s. And of course, the costumes work so beautifully and everything is stylized, and it just works very well.
All right. Well, Kate, this has been wonderful. I think you've given us a taste of what Shakespeare is like, his life, some of the mystique about him. I think just give us one last word of advice, how to get into it, how to start. If you had it in high school, you just never really figured it out. What are we going to do to appreciate it? Give us just a couple of hints as we leave.
I think we could go right back to Shakespeare. He didn't write these plays to be read. I think seeing them is probably your best bet. And I think that looking particularly to Kenneth Branagh as a modern interpreter, he's done some wonderful films of Shakespeare's plays.
So start by looking at the films? Start by looking at a film?
I would think so, yes. Yeah.
So
his Henry V is the best of what he's done, in my opinion. But his Much Ado About Nothing is beautiful. Okay. Those are two good places to start.
And you could probably get them on Netflix or one of the other services, or you could rent them probably easily. And so by watching them, you'll be put in that world, and maybe then you might take another one to read at some point. And you've expressed how important it is, how it shows so many of the emotions in life and the lessons that we learn about life, death, politics, love, hate, all of the things that make us human and that he wrote about beautifully in his works. So I want to thank you, Kate, for coming on and sharing that with us. We could go on, but I hope we've given everybody a little taste of Shakespeare from your point of view. And we have time now. We're home, many of us. Take the time to think about what Kate has said and think about Shakespeare. Okay. Thank you, Shakespeare. Thank you, Kate. We'll see you soon. And everyone, we'll see you soon on Talkback. Bye.